Good day. Firstly, in commencing this video, I'm just going to tie up a loose end with respect to the Azovstal Mariupol saga. I expect that this will be the last mention of Azovstal, of the Azovstal battles, and of Mariupol in this series of videos. Though who knows, there may be some reason to return to the topic later, especially if the Russians do carry out their apparent plans to put some of the people who they've captured in the Azovstal steelworks on trial. Anyway, in my last program, I discussed the fact that, to my knowledge, none of the various reports or claims or rumors about NATO generals, senior Western officials, Western mercenaries, Western foreign legion troops in the Azovstal steelworks have turned out to be true. And I said that this provided some bafflement to me, increased my bafflement at the frenetic attempts by the Ukrainian authorities to evacuate people from the Azovstal steelworks during the siege, even as more and more Ukrainian helicopters and more Ukrainian ships were being destroyed in the attempts to do so. And that President Zelensky had himself admitted very recently in comments that many helicopters and pilots had been lost in these attempts, but he still didn't provide a fully satisfactory explanation of what exactly had happened. Well, what exactly had happened and why this odd step of sending pilots and helicopters to certain destruction had been taken. Well, I think we now probably have an answer. It turns out that one of the people who have been captured by the Russians in the Azovstal steelworks is the actual commander, military commander of the Azov regiment, Denis Prokopenko. Now, I say commander. When I did my previous video, I thought he might be the commander of the Azov forces in Mariupol rather than the overall military leader of the Azov regiment. But it seems that Prokopenko is indeed the overall leader of the Azov regiment. Even Wikipedia says as much. And there are now what appear to be fairly reliable reports that he is one of the people who were captured. Now, during the fighting, during these desperate attempts by the Ukrainians to remove people from the Azovstal steelworks, the Russians repeatedly said that the people that the Ukrainians were trying to evacuate were the commanders, plural, of the Azov regiment. And that seems to me to tie in with the fact that Prokopenko was apparently in Mariupol. He was with the Azov troops in the Azovstal steel factory, and he has now been captured, presumably together with other senior commanders and the staff of the regiment. And I would add that if the overall numbers that have been given in open sources of the numbers of troops or personnel who make up the Azov regiment are true, if it really does number around 2,000 men, then it seems that to me that it has been all but wiped out as an effective fighting force. It seems most of these troops were committed to the defense of Mariupol. Obviously, Mariupol is on the Sea of Azov. It was where the Azov regiment gained its baptism of fire, if one may say that, at the start, during the 2014 fighting. It seems that most of its troops actually stayed in Mariupol. They were encircled there, and they've now been captured. Most of them have been captured or killed, together with their senior commanders. And given the importance of the Azov regiment, both symbolically and I suspect in terms of its political connections with other senior people in the Ukrainian political class, well, that I think does explain these rather desperate attempts to try to evacuate at least the leadership of this regiment, people like Prokopenko, to bring them back to Kiev. Anyway, there it is. It seems he is now a prisoner of the Russians. It seems that the Azov regiment, as it existed, no longer exists. There are probably units and minor units, combat units of the Azov regiment still floating around in various places. But overall, the regiment has ceased to exist and its commander has been captured. Now, that, as I said, is the last thing I'm going to say about the Azovstal battles, the Mariupol battles. Elsewhere in Donbass, we continue to get more and more information all the time about the deteriorating position of the Ukrainian forces in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. And in fact, there's now a widespread rumor. I think I can say at the moment that it is only a rumor, though it's a plausible one, that the Ukrainian military leadership has warned President Zelensky that unless the troops are withdrawn from Severodonetsk within the next few days, and when they refer to Severodonetsk, I'm assuming that this means both Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, unless these Ukrainian troops are withdrawn from Severodonetsk and Lysychansk within the next few days, then it will become impossible to order their retreat. They will be completely encircled and they will face the same outcome as the Ukrainian troops who were encircled in Mariupol. On the subject of the fighting in Donbass, Zelensky himself, by the way, has made some further comments. He has said that Ukraine is losing between 50 and 100 men a day in the fighting in eastern Ukraine. Now, that may be an understatement. That's what most Russian commentators and most people who are looking at the fighting would probably say. But it is a significantly higher estimate of the number of troops Ukraine is losing than Zelensky has come up with before. Anyway, even if it is only 100 men a day, that is a heavy casualty rate. Other estimates put the numbers much higher, in the multiple hundreds. And I have to say that the films and videos that I've seen, which of course are not reliable evidence, they seem to support the view that more people are being killed, even the Zelensky is now admitting to. Anyway, that's the military background to events. It does look as if the situation of the Ukrainian troops in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk is critical. Apparently, an important bridge has been blown up by the Russians, which makes its whatever peripheral resupply of these troops is still taking place. It makes that all but impossible. In the meantime, we are also getting reports that other Ukrainian troops in other places of the northern Donbass have also been encircled as well. And the web, the noose, is tightening around all of these troops, and this is creating, obviously, a military crisis in northern Donbass. And this, together with the deteriorating economic picture, the food supply shortages, the worldwide food supply shortages, the worldwide energy crisis, all of this appears to be triggering ever deepening debate, not just in Ukraine, but in the West, about the direction of the war. In my last program, I discussed an article, an opinion piece that appeared in the New York Times, penned by the editorial team of the New York Times, which appeared to say, in very thinly disguised form, that Ukraine should sit down, negotiate with the Russians, reach a peace agreement with Russia, acknowledge that there's a limit to the amount of help that the Western powers are able to provide, and accept that Ukraine might have to make certain significant territorial concessions. and it looking increasingly as if Italy has very much come round to the same view, and it seems that President Macron of France may be thinking along similar lines. The German government remains bitterly divided between its green factions, which are very much in the ascendant and which still want the war to continue until some sort of Ukrainian victory is achieved, and perhaps the social democratic wing of the government, headed by Chancellor Olaf Scholz, which is clearly beginning to have increasing concerns and doubts about the whole direction that this affair is taking. But anyway, we see that there's been more discussions about all of this in the West and about what Ukraine should do. Well, we have now had responses in Ukraine itself. First of all, we had a response from President Zelensky. Now, President Zelensky once again said, as he has often said in the past, that the war has to end with a diplomatic solution. He didn't say what that was, but the very fact that he's talking about a diplomatic solution at all might suggest that he is heeding the advice of people like the writers of the New York Times article. And this has come from him, and of course it's also come in connection with his admission, if it is an admission, that as many as 100 Ukrainian soldiers are dying in eastern Ukraine every day, even though, as I said, most people who've been following this closely, this conflict closely, think that the true casualty rate is much higher. Anyway, that's President Zelensky. Other Ukrainian officials have come out indignantly and have said that this is out of the question. So the chief of staff of Zelensky's own presidential office has said that Ukraine is not willing to make any territorial concessions whatsoever, that it wants to have complete control, recapture complete control of all the territory it had when it declared independence in 1991, which would of course include Crimea, as well as Donbass, and of course Kherson province, and all those other regions which are currently occupied by the Russians. And the intelligence chief, Ukraine's senior intelligence chief, has said the same thing, and he again floated the possibility of Ukraine launching this great counteroffensive in late August, which would drive out the Russians and recapture all of this territory. And these hardliners in Kiev went on to say that, as far as they're concerned, there's no question of a ceasefire until the Russians have either withdrawn or been thrown back out of the entire territory of Ukraine as it was in 1991. Now, this could be signs that there's been some enormous argument going on within Kiev. Who knows? But if there is such an argument, it seems to me that whoever is supporting the compromise is probably at the moment very, very much isolated. Moreover, I get the impression that the hardliners are not just in the ascendant in Kiev, they remain very much in the ascendant in Washington and London. It seems that President Biden himself continues to be utterly committed to the prolongation of this war in Ukraine, even though there is increasing doubt and skepticism apparently within the US political establishment, as reflected in that New York Times editorial. And I'm increasingly sensing within the US military leadership as well. The Pentagon, I suspect, is becoming increasingly concerned at the enormous overinvestment of US resources in Ukraine, at the way this is starting to drain US military stocks. I'm going to come to that in a moment. And also at the way in which the US is being drawn into a conflict in Ukraine of peripheral importance, where there is no solid support for this commitment amongst the wider US population, and which could prove extremely embarrassing for the US if, in the end, as seems likely, I would say inevitable, Russia eventually prevails. And let me again repeat a point which I've made before. if this war is prolonged, if this war goes on until the end of the year, if as a result of that war, Ukraine loses more and more territory, if Ukraine in fact collapses completely and the Russians score an unequivocal win, it is going to be very difficult for the United States in Europe. Many people assume, and I myself was one of them at the beginning of this conflict, that the United States had come out a winner from this war, that it had choked off sentiment in Europe that wanted some kind of rapprochement with Russia, that it had set Europe off against Russia, that it hardened support for NATO within Europe, and of course we've seen the moves to expand NATO into Scandinavia. That, I think, was true up to the situation in, say, mid-March. But of course, if the situation now ends in a clear-cut military defeat for Ukraine, a clear-cut Russian military victory, and if the Russians gain their overall political objectives in Ukraine, then that will mean that the US will have taken on Russia in a military and economic conflict in Europe and will have lost. Now, already the economic war of attrition, as I have said, has backfired spectacularly. Once again, this morning, the ruble is trading at 58 rubles to the dollar. And there are reports, media reports, which, by the way, have been denied in Moscow by the Russian authorities, that the Russian central bank is now intervening directly in foreign currency markets, buying foreign currency in order to prevent the ruble appreciating even further or too quickly. Now, the Russian central bank has denied this, but it may very well be true. The reason it is probably denying this is that, of course, if the Russian central bank is indeed selling rubles in order to buy foreign currency, which, by the way, would be a way of replenishing its own foreign currency reserves, which, of course, have been depleted after the asset seizures by the United States and its allies in February. If the central bank is doing that, then it is buying that foreign currency from someone. Who is that someone? Well, it might be Russian traders, but one way or the other, it would be most probably an act which would be seen in the United States and perhaps in Europe as a sign that the sanctions against the Russian central bank are not working and are being breached by someone. And that might trigger an investigation, and that might put some people who the Russian central bank is buying this foreign currency from in some jeopardy. So the Russian central bank would be likely to deny reports that it was buying foreign currency, if only to protect the people, the sellers whom it's buying that foreign currency from further Western sanctions. So I just make that point, regardless of whether or not the Russian central bank is indeed buying foreign currency on the foreign exchange markets to slow or stop the appreciation of the ruble, it's absolutely clear that the ruble is not collapsing. At the moment, it is strengthening, and that the expectation that the United States had, that the US government, that the Biden administration had back in February, that the ruble would collapse once the sanctions on the central bank was imposed, those assumptions have turned out to be completely and entirely wrong. Anyway, that's one thing. So that hasn't worked out, nor has there been a hyperinflation crisis in Russia. We've now had, as I said in my previous videos, more economic data from Russia. It seems that despite the decline in interest rates, inflation is now falling fast in Russia, The rise in prices in Russia in April was around 1.5%, slightly more than the usual level, obviously, but a significant decline from the crisis levels in early March. And the sense is, as I discussed before, that Russia might in fact be on the cusp of an actual period of a decline in some prices. Now, I'm going to quickly say that I've seen reports from an American journalist in Moscow. I'm not going to say who he is because I don't want to embarrass anybody, but he's been providing photos of Russian supermarkets which are massively stocked, fully stocked with goods, with foodstuffs. This has provoked an angry reaction in some quarters. People want to insist that food shortages are spreading across Russia. The actual realities on the ground, from everything that I'm hearing, tell the exact contrary. Food stocks are actually growing. But it's more than that, because we're now starting to get indications that the industrial decline that many expected in Russia is turning out to be less severe than many people had anticipated. And we've had comments from the department head of the Russian Central Bank's Monetary Policy Department, Kirill Tremasov, on Friday. And he's talked about the conditions in the real economy. And he said, we conducted a survey throughout April, in May, and we see that the situation is getting slightly better with each survey. We asked companies about various problematic aspects, including rates, what problems they come across on demand, on employment issues, and so on. And we see that starting April, the balance of responses on all those items has been gradually improving, which means the Russian economy has started adjusting to changing conditions fairly fast so far. Despite the tectonic shifts underway in our economy, the goals and principles of monetary policy remain unchanged. Price stability remains a priority. The targeted level of inflation continues to be 4%. And the impression that this gentleman has given is that we are starting, as I said, to see the first signs of a stabilization in the real economy, with a probable rise or recovery in industrial production fairly soon, and a continued fall in inflation back to its 4%. It's the central bank's 4% target. So the economic war of attrition isn't working. And of course, Europe facing deep recession, with growing alarm in Britain, in Germany, right across Europe as to what is happening in the economy. Similar concerns, by the way, in the United States, but perhaps especially in Europe. People in Europe are going to be asking questions. If Europe is in economic crisis and Russia, on the contrary, is recovering or even prospering. So that would be a major psychological blow for the United States. But, of course, it would be overshadowed by the effect of a military defeat in Ukraine, because the United States would have been seen throwing every conceivable weapon system and training system to support Ukraine, but unable in the end to save Ukraine from defeat. Now, if this goes through fully to its conclusion, then we could be seeing a situation where Ukraine is militarily defeated, where there is a pro-Russian government in Kiev, where Ukraine itself might be in existential crisis, where the Russians are in control of large areas of Ukraine, where Russia itself is seeing its economy recover and grow, and where the European economy is in deep crisis, reflecting also perhaps a crisis in the United States. And I have to say, in that kind of situation, there is likely to be a shift of mood in Europe. Many people in Europe will say that the US not only led Europe up the garden path in seeking this strong reaction to the Russian attack on Ukraine, but that when push came to shove, the US was unable to prevail against Russia. It was unable to prevail against Russia economically. It was unable to prevail in the proxy war it is fighting against Russia in Ukraine militarily. And inevitably, that is going to make many people in Europe wonder how strong US guarantees actually are. Whether, in fact, the US really is in a position to take on the Russians militarily. And of course, if it is incapable of prevailing against Russia economically, then of course the sanctions weapon will have been thrown away. And it's not difficult to see how this could create a crisis of credibility for the US in Europe. It's not as if there aren't critics of the US in every European country. There are more of them in some than in others. There's many of them in France, for example. There's a certain number of them in Italy. There's fewer of them in Germany, though they're pretty well organized there. There's fewer still, obviously, in Britain. But there are critics of the US, critics of NATO, critics of the EU, also, by the way, present in every European country. If this ends in failure, then those critics will be emboldened and strengthened, and on the contrary, it will be supporters of the US, supporters of NATO, supporters of the EU leadership who will be dismayed and depressed and demoralized. That will be the exact opposite of the situation that we appear to be looking at the start of this crisis in February and early March. And it must be the case that there are people in Washington who are starting to see that and who are starting to become concerned and who are trying to get the administration to change course and who are advising the Biden White House that this is ending, that the risks are growing, not, in my opinion, risks of World War III or of nuclear war, but of a serious strategic defeat. Now, at the moment, I don't think that these voices are being heeded. President Biden himself remains, as far as I can see, not just personally committed to Ukraine. He is obsessed by Ukraine, and he continues to want to shovel arms, more and more arms, to Ukraine in the hope that this will somehow turn the tide there. And so I don't think there's any prospect of him changing his mind anytime soon. And to be straightforward about it, I don't think he's going to change his mind unless he's forced to. And I think that is probably true of the various neocons who are so heavily entrenched in the State Department and who are also very prominent in other parts of the US permanent state, for example, in the intelligence and security agencies. But in the Pentagon, where these people, it seems to me, are weaker, I suspect the criticism is growing. I suspect it's growing also in the economic departments. I suspect it's even growing on the fringes of the US's think tank community. After all, the US could lose in Afghanistan, and it did not affect US's global power. It could even lose in Vietnam, and it did not affect the US's global power. But a clear-cut defeat for the US in a war in Europe is a completely different matter. So that probably explains some of the reasons for concern and dissent that we are now seeing, though at the moment there is massive pushback against them. And by the way, as somebody who has to read the British media every morning, I've seen some extraordinary articles, including a ferocious article in the Daily Telegraph criticising strongly, even if only by implication, the article that has appeared in the New York Times. Anyway, that's where we are on the diplomatic front. I have, as I've said previously, had a further opportunity now to look at this $40 billion aid package for Ukraine. And what I suspected is, right from the beginning, is looking to be increasingly true. I think a lot of people assumed that this $40 billion package was aid for Ukraine, and I think many people assume that this $40 billion aid package is $40 billion of weapons for Ukraine. And there's been some people who've been pointing out that the total amount of aid for Ukraine, military aid for Ukraine, which now comes to $53 billion, they've been comparing it to Russia's annual military budget, which is around $65 billion. They've been rubbing their hands, and they've been suggesting that this means that before very long, the Russians will be overwhelmed by a flood of American weapons to Ukraine. Well, as far as I can make out, the actual amount of military hardware and training that is committed in this package out of this $40 billion is actually $6 billion. $6 billion not just of weapons, but also of training of Ukrainian troops and things of this kind. Most of the rest is in economic aid, all kinds of other things that are connected in various ways to the war in Ukraine, but which are not direct military aid to Ukraine. Now, I may be reading this wrong, but that's how it seems to me. And that, by the way, is very consistent with what I remember from the previous US commitments to countries like Afghanistan, Iraq, and South Vietnam. The United States comes up with these enormous aid packages. When you unpack them, they always turn out to be much less impressive in detail than the global numbers might imply, and that in fact the actual number of weapon systems that have been sent to Ukraine turn out to be far less than many people anticipated. So far, it remains the case that the United States is unable to replace the weapon systems Ukraine is losing at a sufficiently fast level, even to keep Ukraine fully equipped as it was at the start of the war. In other words, Ukraine is losing more weapon systems than the United States is supplying to it. And of course, we've now had the first debacle with the M777, the M777, as some people call it, howitzers. It seems that most of them have already been destroyed in action, and it seems that a large stock of Western equipment, including American equipment, was also destroyed by the Russians in an arms supply center in Zhytomyr. I would say that it is going to be very problematic for the US to re-equip and rearm Ukraine's army, whilst the Russians are able to launch missile strikes and airstrikes across the entire territory of Ukraine. The weapons may arrive in Ukraine, they may be transported around Ukraine to a certain degree, but the Russians are able to keep track of them, and eventually they have to be kept in one place, because you have to do that with weapons. You can't just scatter them across the whole country, because then, of course, they lose their utility. So they have to be concentrated in some place. That was in Odessa, in Dnipro, in Zhytomyr, and then, of course, they become a target for the Russian missile strikes. So I think it is going to be impossible, however many weapon systems the US funnels into Ukraine, to keep up with Ukrainian losses. And already we're hearing comments from people like Josep Borrell, the EU's High Representative for Foreign Policy. He's complaining that European weapons stocks are now becoming dangerously depleted through the supply efforts to Ukraine. And I suspect the Pentagon is getting concerned, is beginning to worry about the same things, that this is far from rebuilding the Ukrainian army, as some fear. What's actually happening is that the US is sending arms shipments into what is in effect a black hole, where they just get destroyed almost as quickly as they arrive, leaving the US's own stocks of weapons or certain critical weapons depleted, and therefore having to expend vast amounts of money to replenish those stocks. And by the way, my impression, again, is that a large part of this $40 billion aid package is not really intended for Ukraine at all. It's essentially earmarked for the US defense industry to try to replace weapon systems that have already been shipped to Ukraine. In other words, to keep the US military itself in stock, even as the cost continues to grow. So it's not surprising that people in the Pentagon, if they're doing the figures, if they're doing the maths, if they're looking at this thing properly, are starting to become concerned that this war might not be going according to whatever plan the President Biden, and his advisors, his neocon advisors, came up with. Well, as I said, for the moment, it still seems to me as if the hardliners are very much in the ascendant. What has to happen is that we have to start to see people outside the, what you might call, dissident community in the United States starting to come forward and to call for a diplomatic solution. When we start to see prominent people within the McConnell wing of the Republican Party, or even more importantly, the Democratic Party, when people like that start to peel away and start to say that this has gone as far as it can, that's when things will start to shift and we could start to see a real change, of course. Now, by the way, that is what happened in the 1960s over Vietnam. Many people believe still that what changed American policy over Vietnam was vast numbers of anti-war protesters coming out and protesting across the United States. In fact, the political elite in the United States began to turn against the war sometime before that happened. There were growing doubts in Washington in the late 60s that the United States was overinvesting in Vietnam and was becoming diverted into a war which had no satisfactory outcome and was risking a debacle. And there was growing criticism in Congress and within the Pentagon and within some of the more prominent figures within the Democratic Party who began to talk out against the war. Now, much of that initially was in private. It took a while before it appeared public, but of course, eventually it did. And it was these people, perhaps more than the anti-war protesters, who were the reason why eventually President Lyndon Johnson, in the 1960s, decided that he had to sit down with the North Vietnamese in Paris and start peace talks with them. So elite opinion began to turn against the war in the United States. We are perhaps seeing the first, in the 1960s, we're perhaps seeing the first glimmers of something like that starting to happen in the United States with the Ukraine war today. Well, we've still got a long way to go from this, but I will warn this, make this further point. Vietnam was, of course, relative to the United States, a very poor, rather small country. It was not remotely comparable to the US in terms of its overall power. It could draw on a certain amount of support from China and the Soviet Union, and that was enough to keep it fighting. But ultimately, it could not inflict a defeat on the United States, a military defeat on the United States. And of course, the region where the North Vietnam War was fought, Southeast Asia, was not ultimately essential to the United States. This conflict is different. Russia is a vastly more powerful country than North Vietnam. It's a nuclear superpower. It's just tested the Sarmat missile. It's also a major economic player in the global economy, as has now become clear, whereas North Vietnam, to say it straightforwardly, was not. And of course, this conflict is in Europe. It is not in a peripheral region like Southeast Asia. And of course, Europe is central to US power. Those voices of concern in the United States, those people who perhaps are starting deep down to get worried, but perhaps are not yet ready to speak out, those people need to realize that there isn't that much time. In the Vietnam War, well, there was maneuver time, there was space. The United States could maintain the military situation. It could go on fighting. It might be very embarrassing. It might create protesters coming out. But the fact that the war was prolonged wasn't doing fatal damage to the United States in terms of its prestige, its credibility, its overall military position, or even its economy. With Ukraine, it is different. First of all, there may not be so much time, especially if my analysis of what's happening with these arms supplies is correct. The situation, the military situation in Donbass, on the contrary, suggests that the military situation there is going already badly wrong, and it may be that Ukraine has only months rather than years before things reach a critical point. So there may not be that much time on the military side. There may not be that much time on the economic side. And of course, if everything goes wrong together, then Europe, as I said, is far more important to the United States and to its global position than Southeast Asia ever was. So unless these people who have these doubts are prepared to escalate to the most dangerous levels, to threaten nuclear war or something of that nature, to start seriously talking about sending troops into Ukraine to take on the Russians, a disastrous idea, by the way, then the moment for them to speak out is now. Despite whatever political risks they may be incurring, they need to start speaking out now and publicly if the kind of debacle that I've outlined is to be avoided. Will they do so? Will they screw up the courage to that point? That remains to be seen. But that, it seems to me, is the position we are in. It doesn't help, as I said, that we have a president who appears to be utterly obsessed by this war to the point of showing little interest in any other issue. Let us hope that there are people in the political elite in Washington who understand the danger and the gravity, and that they will find the courage to act now and not leave it until it is too late. Well, that's enough from me today. More from me soon on this channel and, of course, on the Duran. Remember, you can find us on other platforms like Rumble and Locals. You can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. Also, don't forget to check out our shop and the great things that you will find there. And last but not least, please remember to tick the like button if you've liked this video and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a very good day.